Today, two states exist on the same peninsula. One exports cars, smartphones, and pop culture. The other is known for nuclear weapons, military parades, and almost complete isolation. But the people of North and South come from the same historical country, speak the same language, and, until recently, were not separated by a national border. To understand how this happened, we have to begin with the peninsula itself. Korea lies between China and Japan, with the Eurasian mainland to the north and open sea to the south. This position brought trade, writing, religion, and technology. But it also placed Korea directly in the path of expanding empires. For much of its history, the challenge was the same: learn from powerful neighbors without being absorbed by them. Korean tradition traces the country's origins to Gojoseon, an ancient kingdom whose foundation is wrapped in legend. The historical picture becomes clearer during the era of the three kingdoms: Goguryeo, Baekje, and Silla. They were rival states with their own armies, courts, and foreign alliances. Goguryeo controlled much of the north and fought Chinese dynasties. Baekje became a maritime power with close links to Japan. Silla, initially the weakest, allied with China's Tang dynasty. With Tang support, Silla defeated Baekje and Goguryeo in the 7th century. But victory created a new problem. Tang China now attempted to control the conquered territory. Silla turned against its former ally and forced Tang forces out of most of the peninsula. It ruled the south, while Balhae emerged in the north. A shared political and cultural world was beginning to take shape. By the early 10th century, Silla had weakened and regional rulers were fighting for power. The kingdom of Goryeo eventually reunified most of the peninsula. Its name would later give the world the word Korea. Goryeo became known for Buddhist art, Celadon ceramics, and movable metal type, used long before it became common in Europe. But cultural achievement did not guarantee political security. In the 13th century, Mongol armies invaded repeatedly. Goryeo resisted for decades, but survived by accepting Mongol domination and close ties to the Yuan imperial court. The state remained Korean, but its freedom of action was sharply reduced. Survival had required compromise with a stronger power. In 1392, a new dynasty replaced Goryeo. It was called Joseon, and it would rule for more than 5 centuries. Joseon reorganized the country around Neo-Confucian principles. Officials were selected through demanding examinations, and the state became more centralized and stable. Its most influential cultural achievement came under King Sejong. Until then, educated Koreans mainly wrote with Chinese characters, which required years of study. In the 15th century, Sejong introduced a new alphabet designed around the sounds of the Korean language. The system made literacy more accessible. Although many elites resisted it, Hangul eventually became a foundation of Korean identity. Joseon's stability, however, could not protect it from events beyond its borders. At the end of the 16th century, Japanese forces invaded, intending to pass through Korea and conquer China. Korean armies suffered devastating early defeats, but resistance grew. On the coast, Admiral Yi Sun-sin repeatedly disrupted Japanese supply lines, making it difficult for the invading armies to maintain their advance. Japan eventually withdrew, but Korea had been ravaged. Later, Manchu invasions forced Joseon to submit to another rising power. The dynasty survived both crises, yet war had reinforced a dangerous lesson. Foreign contact often arrived together with violence. By the 19th century, isolation was no longer a workable defense. Industrial powers were expanding across Asia, and Korea became the focus of competition between China, Japan, and Russia. Japan moved fastest. After defeating China and then Russia, it pushed Korea first into protectorate status and then in 1910 formally annexed the country. For the first time in centuries, an independent Korean state disappeared. Japanese rule transformed the peninsula for the benefit of the empire. Railways, ports, mines, and factories expanded while land and production were directed toward Japanese needs. Political activity was suppressed, and colonial policies attacked Korean language and identity. Resistance never vanished. The March 1st movement brought mass demonstrations in 1919, and independence activists organized both inside Korea and abroad. But liberation came only with Japan's defeat in the Second World War. In 1945, Koreans celebrated the end of colonial rule. Yet they did not regain a unified state. Soviet forces entered from the north. American forces arrived in the south. The two powers divided responsibility for accepting the Japanese surrender along the 38th parallel. The line was supposed to be temporary. Instead, cooperation between the Soviet Union and the United States collapsed as the Cold War began. Each occupation zone developed its own institutions, security forces, and political leadership. In 1948, two governments were established: the Republic of Korea in the south, led by Syngman Rhee, and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north, led by Kim Il-sung. Both claimed the right to govern the entire peninsula. Border clashes increased, and in June 1950, North Korean forces crossed the parallel in a full-scale invasion. Seoul fell within days. South Korean and United Nations forces were pushed into a small defensive area around Busan. Then the war reversed. A United Nations landing at Incheon cut North Korean supply lines. Seoul was recaptured, and UN forces advanced far into the north. But as they approached the Yalu River, China entered the war. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops drove the UN forces south, and Seoul changed hands once again. Eventually, the front stabilized close to where the conflict had begun. What followed was a brutal war of trenches, artillery, and attrition. In 1953, an armistice stopped the fighting and created the demilitarized zone. It did not produce a peace treaty. Millions had been killed, wounded, or displaced. Cities were destroyed, and families were trapped on opposite sides of a border they had never chosen. The war failed to reunify Korea. Instead, it made the division permanent. At first, the future of the two states was not obvious. The North possessed much of Korea's heavy industry and recovered with Soviet and Chinese assistance. The South was poorer, politically unstable, and governed by authoritarian leaders. But their paths gradually separated. North Korea built a tightly controlled state around Kim Il-sung, central planning, and Juche, or self-reliance. Opposition was eliminated, information restricted, and military strength became central to the regime. The system initially produced rapid reconstruction, but isolation, inefficient planning, and the collapse of Soviet support created a severe crisis. During the 1990s, famine killed large numbers of people. The government tightened control and invested heavily in missiles and nuclear weapons. South Korea's early governments were also authoritarian. Under Park Chung-hee, the state directed resources toward family-controlled companies known as chaebol. Factories expanded, exports grew, and investment in education created a skilled workforce. The transformation was extraordinarily fast, but it came with censorship, labor repression, and political violence. Public pressure for democracy continued to grow. In 1987, mass protests helped force constitutional reform and direct presidential elections. Over the following decades, South Korea became a high-income democracy and a global center of technology and culture. Companies such as Samsung and Hyundai became international brands, while Korean film, television, and music reached audiences around the world. So the contrast visible today was not created by ancient hostility between two different peoples. It grew from colonial rule, the rivalry of outside powers, a temporary division that hardened into separate states, and a war that ended without peace. North and South Korea still share centuries of history, but for more than 70 years, they have lived under different governments, different economies, and different versions of the past. One peninsula, one historical civilization, and two countries shaped by the same division in completely different ways.